In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys some more about the printf function. So if you've been following along with this tutorial, we've been using an instruction in our C programs called printf. And printf basically allows us to print different things out onto the screen. In this tutorial, we're going to talk more about what printf does. We're going to look at how we can use it to print out things like variables and also things like different data like numbers and strings and all that stuff. So in order to use printf, we just type out printf, and we're going to make an open and closed parentheses and a semicolon. Now printf is what's called a function, and basically what that means is it performs a specific task or a specific function. In our case, printf just prints something out onto the screen, right? The task that it's doing is printing something out. And it basically works how you'd expect it to work. So if I came in here, I could print out a specific piece of information. And generally when we're using printf, we're going to be printing out text. So I can make an open and closed quotation marks, and I could print out like hello world in here. And now this will print out onto the screen, hello. And inside of printf, I can use all sorts of special characters. So if I wanted to create a new line, for example, I can make a \n, and down here I could type world. And now this will print out a new line. So you'll see hello world on different lines. We can also use these special characters. So for example, I could print out like a quotation mark. So if I just printed a normal quotation mark right here, you'll notice that it's messing this up. So it's sort of like counting this as the entire string. If I wanted to change that, I could just put a \, here, and now this will literally render a quotation mark. So when I run my program, you can see we have a quotation mark there. And so that's kind of like the basic usage, right? You can specify some text that you want to print out onto the screen, and it'll do it. But this printf function is actually extremely powerful, and we can use it to print out different pieces of information. So in addition to just printing out plain text inside of these quotation marks, I could also print out other types of information. For example, I could print out a number. And if I wanted to print out a number, I would have to use something called a format specifier. A format specifier basically tells this printf function that we want to print out a type of data that's not just plain text like this. So if I said %, and then I said D, this would actually allow me to print out a number. So generally when we use these format specifiers, you use this %, and that tells C that you're going to want to print out something special. And then after that, we would type in a specific letter, and that'll tell C what exactly we want to print out. So if I said %D, this means that we want to print out an integer. So all I have to do now is I can make a comma, and over here, I can specify the integer that I want to print out. So I could say like 500. And now this is going to print out 500 to the screen. So you can see over here, we're getting 500. And this is cool because we can interweave these different types of data with text. So I could say like my favorite number is %D, and this acts as a placeholder for this number over here. So when I run my program, now it says my favorite number is 500, and that's really cool. We can also use multiple format specifiers. So in addition to just using this %D, I could also specify another one. So over here, I could say %S, and you'll notice that this is structured similarly to %D. %S is basically going to allow us to include some text. So I can include some more text just like this. So if I said %S, I can make another comma here, and I could say number. And now this is going to print out my favorite %S, so it's going to look for this string of text over here. It's going to insert that in, and it's going to say 500. So now when we run this, it'll say my favorite number is 500. And you'll notice here that I'm using multiple commas. So I'm saying like %S, %D, and over here I have a comma, and I'm specifying the string that I want to print, so the string of characters, and then the integer. And so basically the order that you put these format specifiers inside of your string of text is the order that you need to include them using these commas. So you're going to separate each of them using a comma. So in addition to %S and %D, we can also use a bunch of other ones. And I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the most common. %D will print out an integer like 500, but if we wanted to print out a decimal number, for example, a double, we could say %F, and this is going to allow us to print out a decimal number. So I could say like 500.98754. And now this is going to print this out onto the screen. And actually, I need to build this. So my favorite number is 500.987540. So essentially you can use these printfs and you can use these format specifiers in order to include different data types into your output. So like this is just some general text output, and we can use these different guys to interweave like numbers or other strings and stuff like that. And where these really become useful is when we have variables. So if I was to create like a number variable up here, I could call it like favnum, set it equal to 90. I can use this variable and print it out inside of this printf. So over here, we could make this %d, and instead of printing out this number, we can just access that variable. So I could say favnum, and this will allow me to print out that variable using that printf function. So my favorite number is 90. So that's the basics of using printf. This is a very awesome tool that we can use, and printf is basically just used for us to find out information. So when we're running our programs, a lot of times we're going to want to be able to get some information about what's going on, about what they're doing, and printf can allow us to do that. So don't be afraid to use these different access modifiers. Like I said, %s, %d, %f, those are all sort of the common ones. And you can also use %c, and this will allow you to print out a single character. So I can come over here, create like a character variable. We'll call it mychar and just set it equal to like lowercase I. And I could print this out using %c. So now we could say mychar. And you'll see that we print out I. So play around with printf. It's extremely useful, and it's really going to come in handy when we're writing more complex programs. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with numbers in C. Now, a lot of times when we're writing programs in C, we're going to want to do different things with numbers, whether that's just storing numbers and keeping track of them, or adding, multiplying, subtracting, doing math with numbers, or really just dealing with numbers in general. So I'm just going to give you guys a basic overview of a lot of the stuff we can do with numbers. We're also going to talk about how different number types interact, so how like integers and doubles interact and all that fun stuff. So down here, I am printing out a number. So you can see I'm using this printf function. And inside of these quotation marks, I'm basically saying %f, and %f stands for like a floating point number. So that could be either a double or a float, basically a decimal number. So when we put %f in here, it's going to allow us to print out a decimal number, just like this. And you can see I can run my program and it'll print out 8.9. You'll notice that it's printing out not just 8.9, but it's also printing it out to a very precise decimal point. And that's what C is always going to do. So it's always going to print it out to a very precise decimal. So using these decimals, I can do all sorts of stuff. So obviously I can just print out the decimal, but I could also do things like math. So I could say like 5.0 plus 4.5. And this is going to go ahead and be able to do that for us. So when I run my program, not only is it gonna like print this out, but it's gonna do the actual math operation. And you see we get 9.5. So in addition to addition, we can also use subtraction, division, which is gonna be a /, and multiplication, which is gonna be an asterisk. And you can use all these different things to do the 4 basic math operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So now I wanna talk about how we can use floating point numbers, so like doubles and floats, alongside integers. So let's say I was going to add an integer with a double. So if I said 5 plus 4.5. Well, actually, when we do this, this entire answer is going to get converted into a decimal number. So when I say 5, which is an integer, plus 4.5, we're going to get a floating point number back. So we're going to get 9.5. And basically any operation that you do between an integer and a floating point number is going to return a floating point number back. So that's important to realize. But if I was to change this to 4, now this isn't going to work anymore because this is asking for a floating point number and we're giving it an integer. So when I do math with 2 integers, it's going to give us an integer back. And if I do math with a floating point number and integer, it'll give us a floating point number back. It's also important to realize, for example, if I took 5 and divided it by 4, this should actually be a decimal number, right? And you'd expect us to get a decimal back. But if I just printed out %d, so I printed out the result of the integer 5 divided by the integer 4, I'm actually going to get an integer back. So when I run the program, you'll see we're getting a 1 here. But really, this the answer is 1 technically, but it's 1 with a bunch of decimal points after it, right? It's 1 plus a bunch of other stuff. But when we just do math with two integers, we're going to get an integer back. If I was to say 5 divided by 4.0, and I printed out a decimal, now we're going to get the entire answer back. So we're going to get 1.25. So that's just a little bit about dealing with integers and floating point numbers. We could also take these and put these into variables. So, in addition to just having numbers down here, I could specify a variable like, num, set it equal to 6. And we can go ahead and print num out down here as well. I'm going to need to make this a D. So now we'll be able to print out that variable with no problem. So it can be really useful sometimes to store these numbers inside of variables. I also want to talk to you guys about using more complex mathematical functions. Now in C, we have these things called functions, which are basically just little blocks of code that we can call. And when we call them, they're going to go off and do certain things for us. So they'll like modify a value or give us information about a value. And these functions can be really useful. I'm going to show you guys a couple functions that we can use with math. So I'm just going to come over here and I can actually start using these functions. And all you have to do is just type out the name of the function that you want to use. So by default, C is going to give us access to a bunch of math functions that we can use. So we really don't have to do anything. All we have to do is just type in their names. And I'm going to show you guys one. It's just POW. So I'm just typing in POW. Then I'm going to type in open and closed parentheses. And inside of this parentheses, I can actually give this two numbers. What this is going to do is it's going to take the first number that we give it, and it's going to take it to the second number. So if I said like 2 and 3, and you'll notice I'm separating them with a comma, this is basically going to give us 2 raised to the third power. So it'll give us 2 cubed. So when I run my program, and actually we need to print this out as a decimal number. So this is going to give us a decimal number back. So I need to print this out with F. When I run my program, we're going to get 8 back, just like that. So it's basically cubing 2. I could say like 4 raised to the third power, and now we should get back 64, which we do. So that can be pretty useful. There's a couple other ones I'll show you. Another one is SQRT. So this will allow you to take a number's square root. So if I said like 36 in here, now we're going to print out the square root of 36, which is going to be 6. And there's a couple other ones. So let's say that I had a decimal. I could say CEIL, which stands for ceiling. So if I had like 36.7 or 36.356, this is going to give us the next highest number. So it'll basically round this number up. And this is going to give us 37, as you can see. We can do another one, which is called floor. And floor will do the opposite. So floor will just round the number down no matter what. So if I had like 36.656, this will round it down to 36. So there's all sorts of little, things we can do, little functions that we can call and get information about numbers. And like I said, these functions will either like modify a number, so it would like give us the floor or the ceiling, or sometimes they'll like give us information about numbers. So that's sort of the basics of working with numbers. You can do all sorts of math with numbers. You can add and subtract, multiply, and you can even multiply, add, subtract integer numbers and floating point numbers. So play around with all these different things with numbers. And if you want to find some more of these little math functions, all you have to do is just go online and Google search for C math functions. There's like dozens of these little functions that you can use. But I think these are some of the most widely used. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using comments in C. Now, a comment is a special block of code in C which actually gets ignored when we run our program. So if you want to write a comment, you can use a special starting and ending tag, and any of the text, any of the code, anything that you put inside of that tag isn't going to get executed or really looked at by C. So we can use comments to do all sorts of things. You can leave little notes or little comments inside of your program. You can use comments to temporarily disable certain lines of code. They can be really useful. So I'm going to show you guys the basics. Down here in my program, if I want to create a comment, I can start a comment using a / and an asterisk. And you'll see when I put this asterisk in, all the code in my text editor changed color. And basically what this means is anything that comes after this / and asterisk is going to be considered a comment. In order to close off the comment, I can use another asterisk and another /. You'll see the code changed back to normal code. Inside of these two asterisks, I can basically write out anything I want and it's going to get considered as a comment. So for example, if I, wrote out like my program and I ran my program, this whole thing is going to get ignored by C. So it's just going to print out comments are fun. It's not going to do anything else. And like I said, comments are really useful. So I could leave a little note up here. I could write something like to do, like I have to do something. And a lot of times people will use comments to explain certain lines of code. So I could put a comment here and I could say like this prints out text, right? So maybe, if this was like a really complex line of code, we could use this text in order to explain it. You can also use comments to do something called commenting out a line of code. So for example, let's say I wanted to run my program, but I didn't want to have this line of code in there. Well, one thing I could do would just be to delete the entire line of code, right? So I could delete this code and now I can run my program and it's no longer going to print it out. It's no longer going to do anything. But here's the problem. In order to do that, I had to actually delete the line of code. So instead of deleting it, I could just bring it back and I could comment it out. So I could basically surround it with these comment tags. And now the computer is just going to ignore it. So it's not going to render it because it's been commented out. So now when I run my program, it's going to do the same thing. It won't execute that line of code, but I didn't have to actually delete the line. I could just comment it out. So a lot of times when you're writing programs, you might want to try to run your program without a certain line or a certain series of lines of code. And instead of deleting them and then running the program, you can just comment them out and C will basically ignore them. So that can be really useful. So those are the two basic uses for comments. And essentially comments are open, right? It's just a way that we can write out information in our files that won't get rendered by C. And so you can really use comments to do whatever you want. Now I will say one best practice with comments is to use them sparingly. Generally, you only want to use a comment when you absolutely have to. So it can be really annoying if you open up a C file and there's like comments littered all around. And obviously if you want to put a bunch of comments in your code, I mean, no one's stopping you. But as a best practice going forward, I think generally only using comments when they're absolutely necessary is kind of like a good practice. But again, it's open, you can use comments for whatever you want. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about constants in C. Well, constant is a special type of variable in C which can't be modified. So when I create a constant in C, I'm basically creating a value that is unable to be modified. So I'm going to show you guys basically how this works. Let's say I created a variable. Let's say I created an integer and I just called it num and I set it equal to 5, right? And then I printed out that integer onto the screen. So we can print this out, %d, and I'm just going to print out num, right? So I can create this num variable. I can print it out onto the screen. Let's say that down here I wanted to modify num. So I could basically say num is equal to 8. So I can modify the value that's stored inside of the num variable. And let's come down here and we'll print this out as well. So %d, and we'll print out num again. And actually I'm going to print out a new line here. So when I go ahead and run this program, and I forgot a semicolon, when I go ahead and run this program, you'll see we're printing out 5, and then we modified the value to 8, and then we printed out 8. So I was able to modify this value down here. I was able to modify num. But in certain circumstances in C, you're going to want to create variables, or you're going to want to create values that can't be modified. So these would be values that just like can't change, and those are called constants. So if I wanted to make num a constant, in other words, let's say for some reason I didn't want the num variable to be able to be modified in my program, I could come over here and I could say const, so C-O-N-S-T, and I'm going to say that right before I declare the type. Now you can also say const right after you declare the type, but I've always preferred to just put it before. So I say const int num5, and now this program is actually going to throw an error. So when I try to run this, you'll see down here it's getting highlighted in red. That's because I can't modify a constant. So I'm trying to modify num down here, but I can't because I gave it this const keyword, because it's now considered a constant. So in a lot of cases, you'll want to have variables that just can't be modified, can't be changed. And in a situation like that, you want to make them constants. Also, a lot of times when we make constant variables in C, we'll give them all uppercase names. And this isn't required. This is just sort of like what a lot of developers will do. So they'll say like, instead of num like this, they would say like num. Or maybe this is like your favorite number, so you could say fave_num. So that would be how you could like distinguish two words. But generally, like constants will be all capital, and that's just so it's kind of obvious that they're unchangeable, that they're constants. But again, you don't have to do that, but that's kind of like a best practice. So this is one way that we can create a constant. And we basically create a constant variable that can't be changed. But a constant could also refer to just like any number or any text that we're using in our program. So for example, I'm going to get rid of this. If I came down here and I just like printed out some text, so let's say I just printed out like hello, this is actually also going to be considered a constant. So this is just like a string of characters, a string of text. That's also considered a constant because it's just like text on the screen. We can't change it, we can't modify it, it's just kind of there. So you would also consider this a constant. If I was printing out a number too, like let's say I came over here and printed out 70, 70 is also considered a constant. So it's just considered to be like a piece of information or a piece of data in our program that is sort of unchanging, right? So 70, this isn't going to change. I mean, unless I physically came in here and changed it, like this value is always going to be 90 no matter what. I can't modify it unless I like manually come in and modify it. So that's also considered a constant. But I would say like for the most part, like where this is going to come in handy is obviously doing stuff like this, but creating constant variables that can't change. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to get input from a user in C. So a lot of times in our C programs, we're going to be working with all different types of information. And a lot of times we're going to want to get some of that information from the user. So I'm going to show you guys how we can prompt the user to enter in some information. We can take that information, store it inside of variables, and then we can use it inside of our program. So this is going to be pretty cool. So down here, I will basically write out the code for this. And the first thing we want to do whenever we're getting input from the user is we want to prompt them. So I want to prompt the user, as far as what they should enter in. So I'm just going to say printf, and over here I'm just going to print out a prompt. So why don't we ask the user to enter in their age. So I'll show you guys how we can get a number from the user. So I'm just going to say enter your age. And now that we've prompted them to enter their age, I need to do two things. So the first thing I want to do is create a variable where we can store the input that the user puts into the program. So I want to create a variable where we can store the age that the user inputs. So I'm going to create an int over here. I'll just call it age. And I'm not going to give this a value. So all I'm going to do up here is just declare the variable. I'm just going to tell C that I want to use this variable, but I'm not going to give it a value. In other words, I'm going to allow the user who's inputting the age to give this a value. So down here, I want to be able to get input from the user. So I can use another function which is called scanf. And scanf is basically going to allow the user to enter in some information into our program. And this works similar to printf. It's kind of doing the opposite of printf, right? Printf is printing something out onto the screen. Scanf is allowing the user to input something into the program. And I'm going to make an open and close quotation marks. And in here, I basically want to tell C what type of information I'm asking the user to enter in. So in our case, we're asking for an integer, right? Age is going to be an integer. It's a whole number. So I'm going to accept as an input an integer. And over here, we want to tell C where we want to put that integer. So I'm basically going to tell C what variable I want to store this in. So I'm going to store this inside of my age variable. And I can essentially just type out the name of the variable here. But in order to get input from the user, I'm actually going to have to type an ampersand in front of this. So instead of just typing out age, I'm going to have to type ampersand age. And when I say ampersand age, this is what's called a pointer. And we're going to talk about pointers in a later tutorial. I'm going to cover everything you need to know about pointers. But for now, that's a little bit beyond what we need to learn. So all you need to know is that when you're using scanf and you want to store information inside of like an integer or a float or like a character, you need to use this ampersand over here. So down here, now that we've scanned for the user's age, I'm just gonna go ahead and print it out. So we'll just print out like you are, and I'll say %d years old. And over here, I'm just gonna print out that age variable. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm prompting the user to enter their age. I'm storing whatever age they enter inside of this age variable, and then I'm printing it out to them. So let's go ahead and run this program and we'll see how we did. So I'm gonna run the program and it says enter your age. So let's say someone is 50. When I click enter, it's gonna take that value, it's gonna take that integer that we entered, 50, store it inside of that age variable and print it out. You'll see over here it says you are 50 years old. So that's how we can get an integer from the user. We can also get like a double from the user. So for example, I could say enter your GPA. And so now instead of asking for an integer, we're gonna be asking for a double. So I could come up here and say like double, and we could call this GPA. And now I can do the same thing. But instead of saying D, I wanna say LF. And LF is basically going to tell this scanf function that we're looking for a double. And then obviously instead of age, we're just gonna put GPA inside of here. And so now we can just say like your GPA is, and then we can put %f because we're gonna be printing out a double, and I'll just say GPA. So you'll notice here in printf, when we wanna use a double, we're using %f to print it out. But when we're using scanf, we're gonna use %lf. So that's just like a little difference. And now let's go ahead and run this program, and we should be able to get a GPA. So let's say someone's GPA is like 3.1. Now it says your GPA is 3.1. So that's how we can get a double. I also want to show you guys how we can get a character. So why don't we create a character up here, and we'll just call it grade. And we'll say enter your grade. And now when we want to get a character, we can just say %c. And again, I can just come down here and say ampersand grade. And then down here, we can just say your grade is %c, and we'll go ahead and print out the grade. So now we should be able to get a character from the user. So enter the grade, let's say I got an A, and it says your grade is A. So we can use this scanf to get specific types of input from the user, and we can store those specific types of input inside of variables. Now I also want to show you guys one more thing we can do, which is we can actually get a string from the user. So in addition to getting numbers and a character, we could also get like a string of characters from the user. And this is going to be a little bit different from doing like numbers and characters. So I want to kind of show you guys how we can do this really quick. So over here, let's create a variable. We'll just call it, let's just call it name. So we'll be storing someone's name. And whenever we're creating a string of characters, we always need these open and close square brackets. And inside of here, I'm actually going to specify how many characters I want to be able to store inside this string of characters. So I'm just gonna put 20. And in the past in this course, when we've been creating strings, we haven't put a number in there. We've just kind of said like whatever, right? We've basically just given this a value straight away. But in this particular situation, we're not gonna be giving this variable a value right away. In other words, like I don't know what the user's name is gonna be. Like I don't know that right up front. They're gonna tell us what that is. And so if I'm not gonna give this a value right away, I do actually need to tell C how big I want this variable to be. In other words, I need to tell C how many characters I want this variable to be able to store. And that way C can go ahead and allocate enough memory for this variable. So I'm just gonna put 20, and 20 basically means this will be able to store 20 characters. And I think that's enough for a name. So down here, we'll just say enter your name. And I can use scanf in order to get input in the form of a string, but instead of saying %c, I'm just gonna say %s. And over here, instead of saying ampersand grade, I'm just gonna type out the name of the string of characters. So I don't actually need this ampersand here. I can just specify the name of the string. So down here it says printf your grade is, and actually let's just say your name is, and we'll just say %s. And then over here we can print out the name. So this should work just like it did in the other cases. So let's go ahead and run this. And it says enter your name. So my name is Mike. And you'll see it says your name is Mike. So that works out really well. But there is one problem when we're using scanf in order to get a string from the user. So for example, if I came in here and I said enter your name and I said my name was John Smith, when I click enter, you'll notice that it's only saying your name is John. It's not including Smith over here. And here's the problem. This is because whenever I use this scanf function and I use it with a string, it's only going to grab the characters up to the first space. So once it sees this space, it's going to be like, okay, we're done getting characters, right? So that's kind of a problem. And that's just kind of how scanf works. It's not really, scanf's fault. There is a way that we can modify scanf in order to be able to get input with spaces. But there's another function which I want to show you guys, which we can use to get a line of text from the user, and it's called fgets. And fgets is another function. It's similar to scanf, but fgets is basically going to be more general. So fgets is essentially just going to grab like a whole line of text. It's not going to be able to grab it and store it inside of like an integer or a variable or a character. It's just going to be able to store it inside of like a string of characters. So when we're using fgets, the first argument we want to give it is the name of the variable where we want to store the line of text. So in our case, it's just going to be this name variable. The next thing we want to do is specify how many characters we want to be able to input from the user. So this will essentially limit the amount of characters that the user can input. And this is always a good idea when we're trying to get a string from the user, because one common problem is that the user could try to enter in like 1,000,000 characters and they would overflow the buffer. In other words, like C wouldn't be able to handle accepting that many characters and the program might break. So over here with fgets, we can specify how many characters we want to be able to accept. So I'm just going to say 20 because that's how many characters we can store inside of this variable. And over here, I'm just going to say stdin. And this stands for standard input. And essentially what we're doing over here is we're telling fgets where we want to get the information from. And standard input is essentially just like that little console that we've been using. So now I'm using fgets, and this is going to do exactly what scanf did. So we'll be able to store the input inside of this name variable, but now we'll be able to store multiple words instead of just one single word. So let's run this program, and it says enter your name. So now if we entered in John Smith, you'll see it's able to enter in John Smith. Now, the one downside with just using this fgets is you'll notice that it printed out this new line over here. So let me actually demonstrate this a little bit. So if I was to print out like, just some random text over here, whenever I get input using scanf, so if I entered in John Smith, when I click the enter key, so when I'm entering this by clicking the enter key, that's actually going to represent a new line character, and that's going to get stored inside of the string. So when I click enter, you'll notice it says your name is John Smith, and then it prints out a new line character and it prints out this text. And so that's just something that you need to be aware of when you're using this fgets function. But for the most part, I would say if you're getting input from a user in the form of a string, you can use fgets. You could also use scanf, and you could use multiple %s's, and I'm actually going to show you guys how we could do something like that in a future tutorial. But for the most part, I would say whenever you're getting a string from the user, you just want to use fgets. So that's the basics of getting input from the user. Like I said, there's a couple other things that we can do, and I'm going to talk about at least one other way that we can get strings from the user in a future tutorial. But this is kind of the basics, and you can kind of play around with doing this stuff in your programs.